Thank you all for coming. This is a terrific turnout. And I think as we've got a few people still coming in here, I'll give you a little lay of the land of what we've got planned for you here. I do have queued up a portion of the WOSU Many Happy Returns to Lazarus, the documentary they did when the Lazarus downtown store closed. So we've got about 9 minutes or so of that I think I wanted to show. It has a couple of people who are no longer with us, Mr. Charles Y. Lazarus and Mary Nancy Davis, who was the fashion director at Lazarus for a number of years, so that their voices can be heard too tonight. And then what we're going to do after we see that clip is I'll introduce my esteemed panelists up here, and all of who have worked in the business, and then we'll have them tell some of their stories, and then kind of open up the floor to some conversations from people in the audience who might want to contribute some of their own stories as well. We do have to clear out of here pretty close to about 7 o'clock, I believe around 7:15. There's some students that have to take an exam in this room. So it's what happens when you're on a college campus. So without further ado, I'm just going to turn down the lights here and turn on the video.
Let's start, Lord knows when, probably with my great-grandfather. If you don't like it for some reason, bring it back. We'll gladly take it back.
That's right.
And we take anything back. And I do mean anything.
And some people brought back stuff repeatedly. I can say it now. They bought bridal dresses, silverware, plateware, expensive things, had their party, and then returned the merchandise.
One of the other buyers had made a protest because the people in their department had taken back some things that really he didn't think should have taken back, and they were quite old. And that day, Mr. Charles Lazarus met up with that person and said, "Come here, I want to show you something." And they went out to the front of the building and looked up, and he said, "What does the sign up there say?" And the buyer said, "It says Lazarus." And Mr. Charles said, "When your name is on the front of the building, you can make the decisions about what our return policy is."
One day, Robert Lazarus and I were walking on the second floor, I believe it was, and he looked over and he saw a salesperson and a lady obviously arguing with each other. And he didn't run that kind of a store, so he marched over there. He said to the sales girl, says, what's this about? She says, "Mr. Lazarus, she wants to return this shirt." And Mr. Lazarus says, "Well, give her money back. Make it good." She says, "But Mr. Lazarus, you don't understand. It says J.C. Penney on the label here." He says, "Give her money back." She did.
Occasionally, you might get taken advantage of, but very occasionally. And the good vibrations you got from that policy way outnumbered any time that you were taken advantage of. There are lots of stories.
Lazarus didn't rely solely on its return policy to keep people coming back. The management wanted to make shopping at the store a memorable experience.
And the live alligator was symptomatic. This was in 1909. Of bringing people into the store, creating the kind of excitement that would make people come in.
So when you shopped at Lazarus, you could find everything imaginable. You could return it if you didn't like it, and you could expect something special would happen during your visit.
Then when I got to be a teenager, they brought the two, usually it was one of the two top bands at the time, for teenagers anyway. Fifth Order and Dante would come down and play, and we'd come down, watch them on a Saturday.
With my white kind of girl, yes, she's fine.
Oh, special events it was a circus. It was really a circus. You always had something going on. You had the Italian fair, the British fair. You had celebrities come in.
Ed Sullivan came a couple of times, And he brought Jay Fred mugs one time. I remember they put him in my arms, and that monkey wrapped his arms around my neck and my waist. And I said, take him off. I couldn't stand it, but he was a very loving monkey. We had Gloria Swanson a couple of times, and Cesar Romero. Do those names mean something to you?
Polly Bergen wore the biggest diamond ring I've ever seen. Ann Miller, who just died, she wanted a spaghetti dinner well after midnight.
We had flower shows that brought in thousands of women, and we had a cat show once that was very, very popular, but the entire store, through the ventilation system, got a little smelly. So they tried to perfume the place, and that made it even worse. And I remember that they decided no more cat shows. So there was excitement constantly, and we had modeling in the main dining room every day.
When we first started out, you would have to go through classes, and I was probably maybe 3 to 5 years old, and they walk you through classes and do etiquettes, and then you model. Every season's change, you know, for back to school, Christmas clothing, whatever come up, you were called to model. And they put on a style show, 6 floors, nothing but for children's back then.
Our daughter was 16 months old, and they had a moms and children show. It was probably this time of year. And most of the children either balked about going out, or they cried once they got out on the stage. So I wasn't sure how she was going to respond, but when she walked out with me, she looked everybody in the eye and said, "Hi!" So that was kind of exciting for me and my mother.
I remember one model, Alice Mackenzie, who was kind of like a gazelle anyway, and she was beautiful. She got a head start on that runway, and she leaped off the end of it. She couldn't stop herself and jumped over one of those things that holds the dishes. Jumped right over it onto the floor, got a big hand. She got right up and started walking and went right out. Never hurt her a bit.
Springtime was a wonderful time in Lazarus. And every spring before Easter, the whole first floor, all of the columns, were lined with bird cages, with birds in them, who sang like crazy. And people would come downtown just to see and hear the birds. And it just might happen that they'd buy something while they were there. It just might happen.
We had a bird boy who took care of the birds, and I believe I mentioned once before that he put a drop of whiskey in the bird bath, the little drinking cup for the birds, because there was such a draft, especially on the first floor, and the birds would get croup, and in the morning you'd come there and the birds would be like this, so that helped them. But they were covered each night. Of course, they scratched seed all over the place, and it was a big job keeping up with it, but that was excitement.
Everything from baby animal farms to the 80-year-old teas to teen modeling clinics to everybody was trying to make it a special experience.
Why did we do it? It's show business. That's all merchandising is. Right from the goods, right from the article.
In fact, the store got into show business when it produced Look to Lazarus, one of the first television shows in Columbus, a predecessor of home shopping shows.
It was basically a half-hour commercial show, and then Bill Pepper, some people may remember him, he and I would act as a husband and wife team in selling household items. Since it was a live show, some interesting things would always happen. One time when I was supposed to be selling a shower head, I was behind the shower curtain, of course in a bathing suit, and I was just supposed to stick out my head and then give the pitch for the shower head. Well, the guys behind the scene decided to pull a trick on me. They were always full of it. They turned the cold water on me, and my reaction was starting to laugh because I wasn't expecting this cold water. Of course, the audience wasn't in on the joke, so poor Pat had to come in and kind of take over for me and get me out of that pinch.
Lazarus became more than a place to buy bathroom accessories or a dinette set. This landmark store became a place where rites of passages were observed. For thousands of young Columbus women, that meant learning about grooming, poise, and the impropriety of wearing white shoes with a dark dress. These self-improvement classes were only one of the milestone events people still associate with the store.
My oldest boy, John, Richard, brought him down to have his first haircut, and that was in 1967. And they gave us a graduation certificate with a lock of his hair, saying that he graduated from babyhood. And then the neat thing was, I had another child in '71, Jason, and the same lady that cut my son's hair in '67 is the one that cut my second child's son. So that was really neat to have the same lady do it. And then one of my favorite memories of all time was when I turned 13, my mom said that I could have my first outing alone. So I could take the bus downtown to Lazarus all by myself, and I could eat lunch in the Colonial Room and have the famous celery dressing, and then take the bus back home. So that's one of my favorite memories.
I was working in the display department, and she was working downtown as a secretary for one of the buyers, and the job opened up in the display department, and she took that job, and that's where I met my wife. And we've been married now for 27 years. Like a lot of people, I'm sure, have met their spouses there.
I had mom.
That's, we could go on and on. There are many great stories that are told in this video, this documentary that WOSU put together. So unfortunately, we don't have all that time. And I do want to get to our panelists here who have all worked in the business. And I'd like to introduce Joyce Jeffrey Damon, who is the fashion coordinator for the Goodman store downtown. Joyce was also a Jill of all fashion trades in her career, including selling fashion on the radio in the early 1950s. So she's going to tell you a little bit about that. Kathleen Bush, next to her, was the fashion director for the fashion department store downtown. It was opposite Lazarus on High Street. She started there in 1961, and in 1967 was awarded the National Salute to Youth Award for her work with college, high school, and junior high school advisory boards that were connected with the store that she had set up, and she'll be explaining a little bit more of that to you. Mary Richardson, next to Kathleen, began working for Lazarus in 1962. She worked her way up the ranks to associate buyer for the Lazarus Wedgwood Room, and worked alongside the senior buyer, Alice Crothers, and I think we have some of Alice's relatives here in the audience too, so that's really great. And Danielle Revish, on the far end of the table, arrived on the Columbus fashion scene a little bit later than some of these panelists. She worked for a while at Madison's clothing store downtown on High Street, and she also worked as a model. She taught some of the teen grooming classes that were referred to in the Lazarus video, and is currently special events coordinator and advertising stylist for Federated Macy's, which of course used to be Lazarus. So I'd like to give them all a nice hand and welcome them. And I think we can go ahead and start this. Joyce, if you'd like to tell us about your time I can't believe, selling fashion on the radio.
Well, I'll tell you, I can't talk sitting down. But I will. Is this on?
It's on.
Good. Well, I didn't know you couldn't sell on radio. So naturally, since I came in the back door, I came as a model for North High School, Columbus North, for Lazarus on Saturdays. That's the only touch of fashion I'd had. Then I went ahead with the usual, got married, had a kid, and then suddenly I was on my own again. So I thought, gee, so I was out among joining clubs and doing things, and I got an opportunity to take over Nita Hutch's radio show. Now, some of you remember her. She used to be at the Neal House, which is no longer there either, up in the garden room. She would interview people, club women, what they were doing and all that. So this Hutchison agency came and said, would you group of ladies each take a day and do her show because she's having some problems with her home life. So we did. Monday it was my show. By Wednesday they came and said, please take the thing, take the whole week, take the whole 6 months. So I said, well, all right, you know. So you can tell I don't know how to talk, so there you are. So it was an interview, just chatting with people and going through it was old NGN, which was then the end of the whole area. It was just a really outstanding place, and everybody stayed there that was anybody or an entertainer, so I had lots of people I could interview. But then from there, I had B. Goodman as a sponsor. And I had White's Furniture, and I had Board and Milk, and I had Kenley, and I had other people. But I went down to see Ben, and I couldn't find him. He was across from Lazarus, but I looked everywhere. I went in, finally, somebody on the street said, that's it. It said Gerstenfeld on this big rubber mat. Gerstenfeld. Nothing else on there that said B. Goodman. So when I finally got to him, I said, how do you expect anybody to find you? Why, he said. I said, well, the mat says Gerstenfeld. Uh-huh. I said, but you're B. Goodman. So about 6 months later, he did get a new mat for that. But it was really fun to talk with him. And I said, what are you going to give me this week to advertise? So I would take one outfit that he didn't advertise anywhere else, and then I would go back on my usual radio show and chat about it, and people would call and order it. Well, I decided to have a fashion show, so I went back to Ben and I said, you know, you never do anything out of the store. You need to be seen in public. So let's do a fashion show. So every Thursday noon at Olentangy Inn for 7 years, we did a fashion show. And I had all my models, they'd talk about training them. They came across from Lazarus because they'd been turned down. And I had Muriel Gouthier, who became quite fashionable later, and Sue Walker, who actually worked for Lazarus at one time too in the fashion department. They started out with me, and then they would go across the street where they got paid better, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, I went ahead and had this fashion show. And I would have, at noon, everybody in the dining room would buy, and then on the radio, they would call up B. Goodman and order. And I'd have to go back down that afternoon and refit, because they would sell out so many things that we had that I'd have to go down and pull for the evening show. So that was my major thing I did. Then I met Arthur Godfrey, and I was still working under my married name after my husband had died, which was Bertelman. Now that's not a radio name. So when Godfrey came to town, he thought my little radio show was so much like what he had started out with. Nobody had a script, and nobody said anything. They just talked and did whatever they wanted to do. So he wanted to meet me, so I met him. And in the time, we traveled around a little bit. He had his airplane. He went to Cincinnati. I don't know. I remember that they had Johnny Ray and some of those people. And Tommy Hendricks had that big place out on, was it Broad, I think? They had a big... It's now Wendy's. Anyway, there's a lot of people that went there, and we all ended up there having a dinner that night. Well, the next morning, my son, who was then, I think, about 8, wanted to see the airplane. So I took him out to see the airplane. And we walked through the airplane, and he was going down the aisle saying, this is Joyce, you remember her, this is her son Jeffrey. And all of a sudden he said, that's your name, Joyce Jeffrey. I said, I have no problem with it. The Jeffreys who live in Columbus may not be too happy, but I don't spell it the same way, so that's all right with that. I finally did meet one of them in Aspen on a ski lift. I was actually sitting with him. And he said, who are you? And I said, from Columbus. Oh, yes, and my name is. And he said, oh, no, so you're the girl who uses our name. So I used it ever since and still do. But you know what's going to happen with me? Some of these people brought cards, and I need one that just says stop. Because I could be here 6 months, and I'd never tell the same story twice. So if you want to go on, I'll let you move on. Thank you.
Yeah, I think everyone is going to be back in the lounge area after this, so if you have questions or stories that you want to share with any of these ladies, please feel free to just go up and talk to them. Kathleen, what have you got?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think maybe I should set the stage. A lot of us are in the same age group, but then I see some young people here that maybe you are not familiar with the 60s. And that's when I started working for the fashion company in 1961. It was, at that time, it was Morehouse Fashion. And within about 8 blocks downtown, you could go from Town Street down to Long. And you could walk the entire way, you know, and people would walk back and forth to the different stores, but on one side was Lazarus, and on the other side was the fashion company. And when I started, it was Morehouse Fashion, and then in 1963, it changed to be the fashion company. And it was an unusual time. It was revolutionary in the 60s. I think I need to tell you something about the fashions. I'm a little nervous, so you have to excuse me. I just haven't, I'm not a public speaker anymore. Okay. Okay. Anyhow, in the 60s, we had a lot of new designers. They were coming in from England. You had people like Zandra Rhodes. She was a textile designer. Then you had Mary Quant. And the reason I'm telling you that it was changed, it was revolutionary, is because at that particular time, they came in with what was called the miniskirt. And prior to that, everything after World War II was very traditional. We did have, in the 50s, the hemline Hitler called Christian Dior, and he would say up with the hemlines and down with the hemlines. But then when you got to the 60s, Mary Quant came out with this miniskirt, and it really changed everything. And you'll remember, if you're this old, about Jacqueline Kennedy. She was an icon at that time because her husband became president, and they were young, and then Halston made a pillbox hat for her. And so that became very, very popular. But other than the miniskirt, after 1964, everything really changed because Andre Courage, who was a designer, he came out with a spacesuit. It was all black. And then he put go-go boots with them, and they were white. And then he had white goggles. They called them goggles. And then later, they changed to the white sunglasses. And then there was a lot of psychedelic things going on. We had the hippies. And the hippies were wearing barrel bottoms. And no, well, Joyce has her outfit, which we refer to as Valentino Red, out in the outside in the lounge.
And it's bell bottoms.
Right, it's bell bottoms, and it has the cape. But Emilio Pucci of Italy was making the psychedelic prints. And I don't know if I can talk. I get nervous. They were beautiful prints too. I don't know, I
think this is a great history lesson of the 1960s. I think that Dr. Cunningham's would really appreciate reinforcing for her students.
Right, the psychedelic look. And then, of course, you know, the hippies, and they had beatniks. But prior to that, in the 50s, you know, we had a lot of the men wore the pompadour hair and the black leather jackets. And, of course, Broadway was going Hollywood because we had, in the movies, we had West Side Story. And then we had the romance of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton in the movies. And when the Beatles, which is one of the young groups they had in England, they had the Who and the Lynx, and then they had the Beatles. But when, his name was the one you talked about. Ed Sullivan. When Ed Sullivan brought the Beatles on to the stage, they became the rage, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And they still have a lot of memorabilia about the Beatles. But I wanted to, first of all, let you know about some of the styles and some of the fashions and things that were really going on. By the end of the revolutionary period, starting in the 60s, that ended at the end of the 60s, was our Neil Armstrong, who, I can't talk, I'm sorry. I don't think I'm able to continue talking.
Well, one of the things that I really was interested in when I was talking to Kathleen earlier is she set up these individual, these different boards of different age groups of girls, the college board and the high school board.
Oh yeah, I will tell you that, because my job primarily with the fashion company was to, the main duty was to interest the public and in all the merchandise that we had in the entire store. And the fashion company was a specialty department store, even though we had hard lines and we also had soft lines, housewares and things like that, but primarily it was a fashion specialty department store. And my job, my duty, first duty, was to interest the public in coming in. And I knew that I had to get creative and do something, so I contacted all the principals and the guidance counselors at the high schools, and I told them that if they would send me 3 people each with a fashion notebook and a bunch, I'm sorry, I'm just too nervous tonight to talk. I think Gail can tell my story better than I can.
It's a great story, and I guess Kathleen set up these boards of college-age girls, high school-age girls, and even junior high school-age girls. And these girls got this great opportunity to really work with Kathleen and work with the buyers and choose the merchandise for their age group, what was going to be sold in the stores. And I'm thinking, what a fabulous opportunity. I mean, I think girls today would really jump at that opportunity, girls who are really interested in fashion merchandising as a career. That would be something, and I don't know of a store that's doing that kind of thing today, but those were the types of things that were going on with the fashion directors and trying to bring people into the stores, and that was happening here in Columbus, Ohio. And Kathleen in 1967 got this National Youth Award for doing those kinds of programs. So I think that was a really terrific thing to have, and I think there are probably a number of young girls that came up through those ranks and got their careers going in fashion. There we go.
Wait, let Cindy come. Well, Cindy was...
I'm one of those, and I've been friends with Kathleen ever since. And her husband George and her daughter. And she is a great lady, and I love her, and it was a wonderful opportunity.
Just watch it, baby bear. You better say you love me too.
I have a little story about Cindy because she taught me a major lesson in life. She decided, well, she was on the high school board, and one day we had about 20 fashion shows going on, and I didn't really have time to always say, would you please move that rack back to the back room, or would you please move this here and there and the other? And I just simply said, move it. Well, she didn't like my temperament, she didn't like my tone of voice, so she went to the 5th floor to see the personnel director, Mr. Maneri. And he called me after she went up and gave her dissertation that she wanted me to be fired because she didn't like my attitude and she didn't think I was very nice. And that I needed to learn some manners, you know, like thank you and this and that and the other. And please move this and please do this and that and the other. And so she came back down. And he called me in between time and he said, you know, one of the girls from your high school board that you have working in the fashion office, she came up here and said she wanted you fired because you didn't say please and this and that and the other. Well, she came into the office and she looked at me and she said, Mrs. Bush, don't you know that you get more with honey than you do with vinegar?
See, we all went to North High, that's why.
Actually, one of my first duties at the fashion, as I told you, was to get the public involved and to interpret the fashion trends and to then prepare all of the monthly fashion trends for all of the personnel in the store that had to do with fashion. And this included the merchandise managers, it included the buyers, and it included all the divisional people. My job was really a lot behind the scenes and helping and teaching other people to be good at what they did. I'm sorry, I'm just too nervous tonight to talk about anything. Usually I can talk about everything, but I accompanied the buyers into the markets, and we did a lot of different promotions with different companies, and like Gail was telling you, DuPont was a big chemical company, and they had this offer for $15,000 if you would enter the Salute the Youth Award. And as she told you, we did have several different boards, the junior high school board, the high school board, college board, which we allied that with Mademoiselle magazine. And we were very fortunate to have students from this very university go to New York as apprentices. I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong, I just can't. I'm just a little emotional tonight, I don't know why.
Great story.
It's going down memory lane, I
think.
And,
too many memories.
Yeah, too many good memories, but one I want to tell you for sure. Well, this is like Paul Harvey telling you the rest of the story. You remember him, but see, when the store changed back to the fashion company, I really didn't know that much about history. But on the day that it changed, I was able to meet, I was able to meet Alan Gundersheimer Sr.
Alan Gundersheimer, he started the fashion store
Right.
in 1911.
That's right. Keep going on, Gail, because I was so surprised. I was so surprised because he called me into his office and he said, Kathleen, I understand that you're the fashion director and the special events director. And I said, well, yes, I am. And he said, well, how about history? I'd like to teach you a little bit of something about history. And I said, well, I'd love it. And I was floored, really, to think I was meeting the man that started the store. And then he said to me, well, where do you live? And I said, well, I live at the Park Towers. And he said, well, I live at the Park Towers, too. And he said, we can be friends. And I said, really? And he said, yes, we occupy 2 apartments on the back of a floor. And I said, well, Mrs. Madison is on my floor. So we became friends, and they invited George and I to a lot of their parties, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And I just can't tell you.
I think we need to move on to
Okay. We need to move on to someone that's not as emotional about going down memory lane. Sorry. Go ahead, Mary.
Well, my name is Mary Richardson, and I approach fashion from a different angle. It was my job to see that all these beautiful clothes that were part of the 1960s arrived at Lazarus. And I'm often asked, well, how do you become a buyer? Or how did you become a buyer? And in my case, it was just a stroke of luck. I was a senior at Miami University, and I was tutoring for a business law professor. And he would keep asking me, what are you going to do when you graduate? And I would keep saying, well, I'm not sure. So he said, well, I just think you ought to apply for the executive training program at Lazarus in Columbus. He said, I think you would enjoy that. And after hearing it several times, he finally said, well, I'm just going to call up Fred Cook at Lazarus because he's in charge of executive training. So he made an appointment for me with Mr. Cook, and I made sure that I was there and dressed appropriately. I was hired on the spot. I graduated on a Friday, and I started working at Lazarus on Monday. And it was probably one of the most memorable times of my entire life. Not only was it fun, it was hard work, but it was just so enjoyable to work with all of the very, very nice people and the owners themselves of Lazarus. I'm so glad to see Mr. Robert Lazarus here. And we would see Mr. Robert, we would see Mr. Robert Sr. on the floor even back in the 60s sometimes, and always Mr. Charles, at least a couple times a week. And it was just special. It was like, almost like family. And they made such an impression on so many of their employees. And they had a 20-year club, and there were a lot of people in the 20-year club. Today, of course, probably no one keeps the same job for 20 years, but there was just a tremendous amount of loyalty to Lazarus, to the people that owned Lazarus, to the people that managed Lazarus. Yes, being a buyer was hard work, but the rewards were so great that you enjoyed even the hard work. We did trips, obviously, to New York City to buy goods. We oftentimes went to California. And that was enjoyable, but not nearly as enjoyable as when those goods arrived in Lazarus' store. I would oftentimes go back or go down to the receiving room just to get a peek before they were ticketed or brought to the floor, and it was just like Christmas. And I tried to keep my staff involved in the excitement of these new things coming. And at Lazarus back in the 60s, not only were you the buyer, but you were the department manager, if you can imagine. So you had two hats to wear. You had to take care of the staff on the floor, but you also had to have the goods there for them to sell. One of the most important things I found through the years that I was there was the time I spent on the floor so I could hear firsthand what the clients wanted. And that doesn't happen anymore. But that was just such an important part to me, to hear firsthand what the clients were asking for, so that the next time we went on a buying trip, I had a good idea of what, in fact, we should be looking for. One of my very special times was the time that I spent with Alice Crothers in the Wedgwood room. And she was the most charming person I think I have ever met in retailing. And she taught me so much, and she was so kind. But we had a very special, unique situation. When we would go to market, we oftentimes had a customer in mind when we saw something, a dress, a suit, or whatever. And probably all of you that lived during the 60s remember David Dow suits and all those things like that. But there were some ladies just wanted certain colors, certain styles, whatever. And so we tried to make sure that we covered those requests. And so the retailing situation today, where the buyers are all kind of like in a centralized buying situation. They don't really get to have too much contact with the customers that they're buying those goods for. But back in the 60s, you truly did. You felt a real contact with all of your customers, all of your buyers, and it just was a whole different attitude about merchandising and so forth. And I just feel so much richer having lived through that time and having had the experience of working at Lazarus.
Hello, I'm Danielle Revich, and I have to say that I've enjoyed all the ladies. I especially enjoyed Kathleen because I think that she's a great storyteller. And I wanted to pick up on something where she ended about the 60s and the fashions, and she mentioned how the mini skirts came out and the go-go boots. And I came along in the 70s as a model, actually, and we had hot pants and bell-bottom jeans that dragged the ground. And the hairstyles were long. Girls had long hair. I don't know if any of you remember that, to the waist. And some of us wore afros that were like this, and big earrings and ponchos, and those were exciting fashions back then. I want to start off by saying I actually started my career as a professional model and an assistant buyer at a store in Youngstown, Ohio, where we're from, called Strauss's. Became engaged to my husband. He started here in radio a couple months before we got married, and we came here and started having children. And I had my little 3-month-old baby, and I was a stay-at-home mom at that time. But I wanted to get back into fashion. I wanted to get back into modeling. So we were living in Bexley at the time, and I used to teach at Barbizon in Youngstown. So I walked to a modeling school that was well known here in the city called Kathleen Bush Modeling School, an agency. I don't know if any of you remember that. But when Kathleen left the fashion, and I don't really know your whole story, but I do remember Kathleen Bush Modeling School, because I walked in there with my little baby in my arms. I didn't quite look like a professional model with a 3-month-old baby. But I said to her, I am a professional model, and I have taught at Barbizon Modeling School, and I'd like a job. And she gave it to me. She gave me my first job here in Columbus, Ohio. So she's very special to me. My days at Lazarus started in the 70s, and that little girl, my 3-month-old, was maybe about 2 years old at the time. I went to a luncheon downtown, and they asked me to actually model. I didn't even get a chance to tell them I was a model. They asked me to model. I started working in the fashion office. At that time, the fashion director was Jenny Rupp. The person that was over the fashion office was Chris Henry. We modeled as an assignment. Our modeling assignment was to model in major fashion shows that were in the stores, on the floors, on the 3rd floor, and also in the Chinch Room. Anybody remember the Chinch Room? Oh my gosh, when I got that opportunity, it was a thrill. We had to model 3 to 4 days out of the week for 2 months at a time, seasonally, in the spring and fall. I was out on the floor one day because as a model, we had to select our own clothes for the week to model. Our own clothes, our own accessories. And I was pulling merchandise, pulling my clothes, and it was big fun. Because Lazarus had everything, and it was just an event, just to be in the store, let alone model. One of the fashion coordinators came up to me and said, Danielle, we've been watching you, and we'd like you to be a fashion coordinator in the fashion office. And, whoa, my gosh, this was a thrill of my life. I started not only modeling, but I became a fashion coordinator in the fashion office, and then they asked me to commentate all of the fashion shows. The best training that I ever received in my career was the days that I spent at Lazarus. That is how I ended up doing shows for Montaldo's, doing shows for Jacobson's, Marshall Fields, and all of the stores that were in the city center, the major stores. I became the go-to fashion show producer here in town that does those. But I also model for the Union and several other stores. Getting back to Lazarus, because I don't want to leave anything out. And I will look at my notes. I also worked in advertising and worked on the daily ads. Remember daily ads that came out in the paper? It was always an event to see the designers and see exactly what was on sale and what was new. We produced major fashion shows at the Neal House, the Sheraton, and other wonderful venues. In the 80s, I traveled for Lazarus and went to a place called Evansville, Illinois, and worked with a designer called Gloria Vanderbilt. Remember Gloria Vanderbilt? You can't imagine what that was like, little me, working alongside of her. At that time, she was a major designer that Lazarus highlighted in their store, and they were doing shows with her in all the stores. So my assignment was to go to Evansville and pull a show, and she came in as the designer and looked over my selections and critiqued, and we pulled together this wonderful show. And she was a wonderful, beautiful woman. Also at Evansville, it was my assignment to put together a college board, a junior advisory team similar to what Kathleen had done. And I had to select these people, and they were teenagers. And again, they did fashion shows and a lot of events for teens. Lazarus didn't leave anyone out. They had something for everyone. I taught the self-improvement classes, and we had special events, and I noticed in the video, they mentioned the British affair and the Italian affair. I don't know if any of you remember those. They were huge, major events. Michael Boyle was the store president at the time, and I worked under his special events director, who was Rick Wanatek, who is now working with Les Wexner and had gone on to produce major Victoria's Secret shows. But those two spearheaded major events in the store. Every floor featured something from vendors from Great Britain, from England, from Italy, from major designers that were featured at that time. And I actually brought a knit coat that I bought from the British affair. And you know, they don't make things like they used to. How many know that they don't? And so those garments that are out there, they're just, you can open them up and look on the inside and it looks just as good as the outside. I'm going to close, but I also, before I do, I wanted to mention that in the 70s and 80s, the buyers were still there. And this was before it was bought by Federated, Lazarus was, and corporate offices moved to Shillitoes in Cincinnati. But when the buyers were there, it was so exciting because, as she mentioned, you could go to receiving and see all of the new merchandise, and when it came out on the floor, that was another major event for us in the fashion office, selecting the new garments that they had chosen and purchased for the store. As a model, one of the best things that ever happened to me was modeling for Lola Hansen. Lola Hansen bought the dresses in the dress department on the 3rd floor for years. She was one of the most colorful ladies that I have ever met. I don't know if you remember her, but she was larger than life, and just to be chosen to model for her was so important. Also, Mr. Hamilton used to be over the furs, and I had an opportunity to model for him and actually buy one of those furs and have my Lazarus label on the inside of my fur. Well, for me, as a young woman in my late 20s, that was a big deal, to have a fur coat that said Lazarus. I'm going to close talking about the animated window. Anybody remember Christmas time? Oh my gosh, it was so much fun to take our children, our son and daughter, down to see the animated window at Christmas. And not only did they get an opportunity to look at it, but when they were 3 and 4, they were actually in the sleigh, in the window, in one of the ads in the paper, and I still have that. Lazarus was a wonderful place. It was fascinating. I am still a diehard Lazarus customer. I have worked for Lazarus, Rich's, Macy's from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and when I go through the stores pulling merchandise now, people still remember me from the early days in the 70s, and that's a great feeling.
I don't want to forget my family, the Goodmans. I had a grand time in that little store. We weren't a department store, we were a specialty store. So when I did a fashion show, I had to run across the street to Baker's to get the shoes, and run out to Grandview to Roxy's to get the hats. But I did that for 7 years, and we had a wonderful reputation. And I don't know how many shows. We averaged about 3 a week at one time there. We're really going mad. And the red outfit out front was one that she mentioned about buyers. Mrs. Goodman, who I call Cressa. Cressa was off a buying trip with Ben, and they came back with this scarlet outfit. And I saw it when it came in, I thought, I've got to have that. That's all there is to it. So they said, all right, they'll buy one more. So just the 2 of us had those in this, and they were just gorgeous. And I love Cressa. She used to come in the store every now and then and help out. They sent me everywhere to help out too. And by the way, we weren't just downtown. We were all over. We were in Northern Lights, we were in Graceland, we were in Great Southern, and we were in town and country. And Michael's here tonight. Thank you.
I wanted to add something else to Joyce's story. When Al Green was when I started in 1961, Al Green was the president, and he hired me. But then there came a time, like Joyce said, that they went into all the suburbs, all of the different stores. Federated was a buying office that had Lazarus. I was with an Allied department store. However, since everything was going out to Kingsdale, it was going out to Town and Country, and it was going to Northland. But that's when Al Green didn't agree with it. He had his own mindset. And so I went through 3 young, up-and-coming presidents at the fashion company. And the first one was Frank Harvey, who was an ex-football player who had married Miss Virginia. And it was exciting. And then there was Jim Posner. He was from New York City. And then there was Howard Kane. And each one wanted to make a clean sweep of the store. They wanted to change everything. They wanted to change the signage. They wanted to change the badges that we wore, you know. It was just everything in the store. And it's an experience when you are working for a large department store like that, to have different people come in, and you have to rotate in through all these different people and all the different personalities. But that's what happened with the fashion company, and the reason it went out of business in the late 60s was because they never decided Well, Al Green went into the electronic business, and he was very, very successful, but that's the reason why the fashion company did not exist as an allied department store, is because they decided not to go. But I want to tell Gail something. Harry Heim was a vice president. You remember Harry. And one day I said to Harry, he used to come to our store a lot, and I said, I'd like to have the recipe for the chicken salad in the chintz room. And he said, well, Kathleen, I'll get it for you. So he said he went to see Robert Lazarus, and he said he got the recipe, and I do have the original recipe. I may give that to you because recipe books are getting popular again, and maybe you can print it or something, because it's delicious. We used to go to the chintz room and have that chicken salad.
I think, yeah, that was one of the things in the documentary. The chintz room was mentioned, as all the restaurants that Lazarus were mentioned.
Yeah, that's right. The chicken salad was the best.
Dressing, that was the celery dressing with chicken gravy. Yes, sir. Yeah, celery dressing with chicken gravy and a Coke. I think every kid in the world had one of those eventually.
Yeah, it was fabulous.
Right, well, I'd just like to say we're kind of getting down to the wire here. We might have time for one or two questions for our panelists. If anybody's got anything or any comments they'd like to make, Nancy?
It's not a question, it's a comment.
Okay.
About Laura, I have to tell you that about 3 weeks ago in our church, and she was a member of our church, Dr. Wing mentioned her for about 5 minutes. He always calls her fabulous, which is the word everybody thinks of when they think of her.
That's right.
And I bet he talked about, and that's about the 3rd time he's done that since she's been gone.
Well, she certainly was a woman with presence and made a strong impression.
I would also like to introduce a lifelong friend of mine, like Joyce, who we went to the Kenley Players, and of course I was able to invite all the different stars to come over to the store, and people like Joan Rivers, and there was just so many different people. But I'd like to introduce Fran Lukoff, who was on our fashion advisory board. Franny, will you stand up, please? Take your jacket off, honey, and show them your outfit. Franny is a designer, and in I think it must have been 67, Fran was, the Citizen Journal was a newspaper other than the Dispatch, and Fran was on our fashion advisory board. We had all of the, turn around and show them your outfit, because Fran designed this outfit. And she's really quite a unique designer. And the year that they named me Career Woman of the Year in 67, they named Franny the Hostess of the Year because she was well known in the community. We had Mrs. Napoleon Bell. You probably know who that is. And we had Mrs. Duncan, whose husband went to the Supreme Court, was on the Fashion Advisory Board. And we gave a champagne brunch once a month. And they could invite 8 of their guests, and we would serve them champagne. And Robbins Distributing Company would send me cases to try out all the different drinks, and I would be able to
happened to me.
That's what happened to me, Joyce said. But Fran and I have remained close friends for all of the years from the 60s on, and that's how I met Joyce, because she was dating a Hungarian freedom fighter who came from Hungary, and she would go with my husband George and I. They invited us to the Kenley Players to meet all the movie stars that came in, and all the people from Broadway that was in all the shows. And so we would go and have hors d'oeuvres and cocktails, and then we'd meet all of these people. And I have so many stories that I'd have to fill a book. But thank you, Franny. I'm so happy you would come. And thank you, Cindy. I'm so happy that you would come.
One of the other things I think we have to mention too is there was a Lukoff's department store in Columbus, Ohio, that was on Main Street across from the Southern Theater. And that wasn't one of the high street stores, but there were several stores that were not necessarily along High Street.
Right.
I think that we kind of have to wrap things up so that the other class can come in here after us and those students can take their exams.